How to choose a solar inverter. The first thing you're going to come up against when looking at solar inverters is which of the dozens of brands available in Australia should you trust to put on your house. Well, the simplest way I know to advise you is to simply show you which brands I'd trust. So here's a chart. On the left are the more budget inverters, on the right are the more premium inverters. All these brands I would be happy to have on my house. I personally like to pay a bit more for quality, so I'm going to err towards the right side of the chart. But all these inverter brands are well supported in Australia and should be fine on your house. Now, what you might not realise is that the component of your solar system that is most likely to fail in the first 10 to 15 years is the inverter. So for that reason, if you have limited funds, I would go for a premium inverter over a really premium panel. That's because, like I say, it's most likely to fail in the first 10 to 15 years, and you want to have quality that's A, not as likely to fail, and B, if it does fail, you're going to get good service and they're not going to quibble over the warranty. And the more you pay, the more chance you have that that's going to happen. Solar inverter warranties. Now, what you probably don't realize is that the standard warranty with a solar inverter is only 5 years, but there are plenty of brands that now offer 10-year warranties. Like I said, this is the most likely component to fail in the first 10 years, so go for a 10-year warranty. You might as well, because they're available on everything from the budget ones through to the premium ones. You may have to pay a couple of $100 more for a 10-year warranty, but it's absolutely worth it in my opinion. So insist on a 10-year warranty with your inverter. Now let's talk about microinverters. Microinverters are a special kind of teeny tiny inverter where you put one little inverter on every panel. Why would you go for these? Well, they have several advantages. One, they optimize each panel individually. What you might not know is that with a conventional inverter, where you have one inverter per solar system, if one panel gets shaded, maybe a bird poos on it, that drags down every other panel in the string to the same level, so you lose power in all the panels. Imagine you've got a hose with water going through it. You stand on the hose in one place, it reduces the flow in the entire hose, and that's what happens with the current through all the solar panels. So someone invented microinverters. They optimize each panel individually, so if one panel gets wiped out by bird poo, the others hum along just fine. Other advantages of microinverters, you get lower voltages on your roof. If you're worried about high voltages on your roof, microinverters are safer because they do use lower voltages. Me, for example, I'm an idiot that lives in a straw house. The wires go through straw bales. So I went for microinverters because I didn't want 600 volts going through straw bales. The other nice thing about microinverters, if you're that way inclined, is you can monitor each individual panel's power. To be honest, I've got microinverters, and after about 6 months, I haven't looked at the individual power of the panels. But if you want that monitoring, it's there. The disadvantage of microinverters is generally they'll add about 20% to the cost of your solar system. You do have an inverter per panel, so they are more expensive. Another option, if you don't want microinverters, is the central inverter with things called DC optimizers. These are little cheaper boxes of electronics that you put on your solar panels, and they give you the panel level optimization, often slightly cheaper, but generally works out around the same, about a 20% premium if you want this individually optimized panel. So that's microinverters versus central inverters versus DC optimizers. Solar inverters and oversizing. When I talk about oversizing, I'm talking about installing more solar panels than what your solar inverter is rated at. Now, I get emails all the time saying, I've got a quote for solar, they've offered me a 5 kilowatt inverter and 6.6 kilowatts of panels. What's going on? Am I going to blow up the inverter? Am I going to lose energy? This is called inverter oversizing, and it's a really smart design move. There's a few reasons. One, most electricity networks in Australia will only let you have a maximum of 5 kilowatts of inverter. Now, the guidelines say you can oversize this capacity by 133% and still claim the rebate. So, for example, that would be putting 6.6 kilowatts of panels on a 5 kilowatt inverter. In terms of operation, it's totally safe. You're not going to overload the inverter. In terms of energy production, you get a whole lot more energy. Now, people worry that the mismatch, the 6.6 kilowatts of panels and the 5 kilowatt inverter, you'll clip the energy. Well, you will sometimes, but only on a perfect day. 6.6 kilowatts of solar panels will very rarely give you 6.6 kilowatts because of losses in the system. And to offset that, generally the harder you work an inverter, the more efficient it is. So if you've got more solar panels than what the inverter's rated at, you're working that inverter harder and you're generally getting a more efficient system. So in terms of real numbers, you're losing maybe a handful of kilowatt hours a year having 6.6 kilowatt of panels with a 5 kilowatt inverter compared to 6.6 kilowatts of panels and a 6.6 kilowatts inverter. But you're saving a heap of money on a smaller inverter, and more to the point, you're only actually allowed usually to install a 5 kilowatt inverter. So you're getting much more energy from that inverter, and the icing on the cake is the way the solar rebate works is it's based on the number of panels, not the size of the inverter. So you're getting that extra 1.6 kilowatts of panels at a very steep discount, sometimes almost for nothing, just the cost of the installation and the racking because of the way the solar rebate works. So I always recommend, where possible, oversize your solar inverter with extra panels. Now, batteries are all over the news at the moment, and batteries are great for a lot of things, but they are still very expensive and unlikely to pay for themselves. So a lot of people are thinking, I want to add batteries in the future. Smart move. Do you need a special type of battery compatible inverter? No. You can add batteries to any solar inverter using a technique that I won't get too technical about called AC coupling. What that means is it goes in on the AC. That's the 230 volts wires that your whole house runs on. You just connect the battery into those two wires. That's a bit more complicated. But what it does mean is that an AC coupled battery system like the Tesla Powerwall 2 or plenty of other systems can be retrofitted to any solar inverter. You do not need to buy a special inverter to be battery compatible. Good news. I just now want to talk about solar monitoring. If you buy an inverter that doesn't have monitoring of the solar power and monitoring of your home consumption, which is how much energy you use, which is a separate thing, I highly recommend getting it. So ask your installer if you can have solar monitoring and consumption monitoring on your inverter. If he says it's not possible, usually it's the consumption that's the problem, then seriously consider a third-party monitoring system. At the time of filming, my favorite is one called Solar Analytics. It adds about $300 to $500 to your system, but it gives you a really good insight into how much energy you're using and how much solar you're generating. And more than that, it will send you an email if it thinks anything is wrong with your system. And it doesn't just have to fall over. If it thinks you're generating a few percent less than you should, based on the weather, based on the orientation of the panels, you'll get an email and you'll get a warning. And that's a really good insurance policy against getting big bills if your system fails or underperforms. So if your inverter doesn't have really good solar monitoring and consumption monitoring, I really strongly advise getting a third-party monitoring system. So that was a fairly long video about solar inverters, but they're really important. They're the beating heart of your system. They're probably the first thing that's going to fail on a system that's going to be on your roof for 30 years if it's good quality. So if you can afford it, err towards the right-hand side of that chart, quality premium inverters. If you want microinverters, if you have a difficult roof, if you have shading, if you like the idea of more monitoring, consider microinverters or their little brother, DC optimizers. Talk to your installer about that. Insist on a 10-year warranty. Push hard on that one. You should get a 10-year warranty on your inverter because they are available. Oversizing, don't get freaked out if your installer offers you a smaller inverter than the size of your panel array. It's really good design, really cost-effective design. In terms of adding batteries to your system at a later date, don't worry about it. Like I said, a good AC-coupled battery system can be retrofitted to any solar inverter. Don't be talked into a battery-compatible inverter. You don't need it. And finally, monitoring, in my opinion, is really important. It's the icing on the cake that makes your solar system bulletproof, so you know if something's gone wrong, and lets you look at your consumption and manage it to get the tiniest bills possible. Ask your installer if you get solar monitoring and consumption monitoring with your inverter. If you don't, I highly recommend a third-party monitoring system.